Hello comrades, it's Comrade Reese here, and today I've had another brilliant suggestion from one of my comrades yet again on my Google Plus community, and the name of this comrade of mine is Jeff Smith. So thank you comrade Jeff Smith for suggesting this video to me. I think you had the same idea in your head as I did, because I have noticed one or two Zionists floating about in the comment section of this channel, and I've even removed one Zionist from my Google Plus community. So today comrades, I'm going to be talking about Israeli Zionist imperialism and the struggle of the great Palestinian people who are standing against it. In this video, I will be looking at why Israel is an imperialist country, and I'll also be looking at this whole ridiculous notion of anti-imperialists and Marxist-Leninists being branded as so-called anti-Semites for standing against Israel. I'll also be looking at why Palestinian people should have our support as well. So without further ado comrades, let's get on with the video. To start off this video, we must first look at what Zionism really is, so that we get a better understanding when it comes to supporting the Palestinians' anti-imperialist struggle against Israel. Zionism, unlike many would claim to you, is not a tenet of Judaism. It is a tool of imperialism. Zionism is an ideology with the purpose of maintaining the imperialist domination over the Middle East, especially as the Middle East is rich in resources like oil and gas. And many Jewish people, however, have found themselves being subjugated by the toxic, warmongering, racist, and downright fucking evil structure of imperialism that is Zionism. Hence the reason why they are unaware of the very nature of it and why they should very well be standing against it. This could definitely explain why a lot of people who have been subjugated by Zionism will tell you that standing against Israel makes you anti-Semitic. But comrades, what Zionists can't seem to understand here is the true definition of anti-Semitism. The definition of anti-Semitism is being hostile to Jewish people simply because they are Jewish. In other words, empty-headed prejudice that is aimed to divide people. That is what anti-Semitism is. However, standing against a country that massacres and pillages the Palestinians in the Middle East to maintain domination over their resources and to rob them of their wealth does not make you anti-Semitic, makes you anti-imperialist. On the 2nd of November 1917, so just over 100 years ago, the infamous Balfour Declaration was put forward. This declaration was a letter on behalf of the British Foreign Office from Arthur James Balfour, who at the time was the British Foreign Secretary to Lionel Walter Rothschild, or Lord Rothschild as he was known as. At the time, Rothschild was a good friend of Balfour and was also the president of the English Zionist Federation. In this letter, Balfour wrote, quote, "I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Close quote. Zionists are adamant that the Balfour Declaration was the direct result of the relentless struggle of the Jewish masses for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. But contrary to that ridiculous and quite frankly laughable notion, a vast majority of the Jewish people were very much against the idea, as the origin of such an idea had absolutely nothing to do with them. In fact, most Jews actually regarded Zionism as a mad and crazy fantasy. This is because Zionism is an instrument of imperialism that is widely promoted by the British ruling class as a way of trying to justify Israeli Zionist imperialism and to also protect Israel's interests in the Middle East. The only ones who actually supported this declaration were a tiny minority of incredibly rich Zionists like Weizmann and Sokolow. Anglo-Judaism as a whole in 1917 was quite hostile to Zionism. We can see this by looking at the fact that only 5,000 Anglo-Jews out of a total population of around 250,000 Anglo-Jews, that was really only about 0.25% of the British Jews at the time, were members of the English Zionist Federation. Stuart A. Cohen notes in the Balfour Centenary edition of the Jewish Chronicle, quote, "The so-called mass meetings, occasionally convened in urban centres with a high density of Jewish immigrants, presumed to be Zionism's so-called natural constituency, rarely lived up to their billing," close quote. The Jewish masses, on the other hand, had much more important things on their minds. The burning issues in East London had absolutely nothing to do with Zionism. What worried the Jewish immigrants the most out of everything was whether or not the British government would deport them from the country, or how their friends, families and loved ones were doing back in Russia, as Tsarist Russia was known as the prison house of nations. All of the vast cultural and ethnic groups living within the Russian Empire were repressed and oppressed. Many Jews living in Tsarist Russia were faced with prejudice and discrimination and were struggling against slum landlords and sweatshop employers. Therefore, the loudest participants in these debates were not the supporters of Zionism, but the ones who were against Zionism. Fiercely opposed to Zionism were not only the masses of Jewish immigrants, but also most native-born vocal anti-Zionists, many of whom were actually members of the Anglo-Jewish bourgeoisie, like Edwin Montagu, for instance. Edwin was the son of Lord Swaithling, who was a Jewish banker. He was made the Secretary of State for India, and he delivered to the British cabinet a very anti-Zionist message. Also, people like David Alexander, who were the leaders of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, wrote to the Times denouncing the plan for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people on May the 24th, 1917, to attempt to block the Balfour Declaration. Now, this could definitely explain the major unpopularity underlying the very idea of the Balfour Declaration, as well as the hostility that it had aroused among all classes of British Jews that resulted in the Balfour Declaration being sent in the form of a letter to Lord Rothschild and not made a subject of parliamentary announcement. Therefore, it's pretty clear to see why Zionists had not won over the vast majority of Jews in Britain, or anywhere else, to be honest with you. Actually, it was because the government had suddenly realised anti-Zionism ran throughout the Jewish community, as this then dictated how the Balfour Declaration would be represented. So the only way to get past the recognised Jewish establishment and avoid any inconvenience of an unseemly intra-communal brawl was putting it into a letter to Lord Rothschild. The British press received the Balfour Declaration with the same amount of unenthusiasm, but the Manchester Guardian was an exception because they were very supportive of Zionism. Scott dedicated his editorial on the day that his newspaper published the news, calling the declaration, quote, "at once the fulfillment of an aspiration, the signpost of a destiny. Never since the days of the dispersion has the extraordinary people scattered over the earth in every country of modern European and of the old Arabic civilization surrendered the hope of an ultimate return to the historic seat of its national existence. This has formed part of its ideal life and is the ever-recurring note of its religious ritual," close quote. The Guardian, which is a liberal newspaper, has never ditched this editorial's ideology. To this very day, The Guardian carries on spreading Zionist propaganda. Mr. Cohen correctly pointed out in his article that even though the Balfour Declaration, quote, "owed very little to the Zionists within Anglo-Jewry, the latter certainly owed much of the Balfour Declaration," close quote. And the declaration was, quote, "conferred on the Zionists an unprecedented degree of communal legitimacy. Once considered a fringe element of fantasists, they now posed as a group of hard-headed realists who had the ears of the great and mighty of the land. Hence, although anti-Zionism still remained a force, it was Zionism that henceforth exerted increasing control over Anglo-Jewish hearts, minds and purses," close quote. At the peace conference in 1919, 1920, and also 2 years later in 1922 at San Remo, the League of Nations voted in favour of the mandatory power in Palestine being Britain. The mandate included the wording of the Balfour Declaration, which was kind of an international stamp of approval, if you like. The declaration's second half noted that, quote, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." This was, and also still is, breached. The Balfour Declaration is a perfect example of the deceitfulness of imperialism, particularly British imperialism. While the British High Commissioner in Egypt was promising an undivided Arab state to the Sharif of Mecca, who had begun the revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain was busy with the Sykes-Picot Agreement that carved up the dissolving Ottoman Empire between Britain, France and Russia. That country was taken out of the equation by the October Socialist Revolution in Russia. The Bolshevik revolutionary government then published the secret treaties between the imperialist powers, and it exposed the fraudulent nature of the reason that tries to justify the involvement of the Allied imperialist powers in the horrible slaughter of workers that was the First World War. The Balfour Declaration was nothing more than an empty promise at the time of its making, because Palestine was actually part of the Ottoman Empire and Britain had no right of way over its disposal, let alone to give it to a people who had no claim to the country whatsoever and who, as a matter of fact, didn't actually live there in the first place. The British authorities started permitting the Jewish Agency throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, which was a government of Jews in Palestine, to develop institutions and infrastructure that would lay the foundations for the establishment of Israel at a later date. This was something that was not allowed to the Palestinians. The Jewish immigrant population in Palestine, all the while, was increasing significantly, which is not surprising when we see that at around this time the Nazis were just coming to power in Germany. The Palestinians had risen up in a revolt that lasted from 1936 to 1939 because they could sense that their future statehood was in great danger of being colonized. Britain had crushed the uprising with brutal force. However, with the Second World War just around the corner, Britain was forced to take measures to make the condition of the Palestinian people better. This is why Britain had promised to end all Jewish immigration to Palestine within 5 years in 1939. This ultimately brought some serious tensions between the Zionist establishment and the British authorities. After the Second World War was over, it led to armed attacks by the terrorist group of Zionists called the Stern Gang. The Stern Gang murdered the British minister in Cairo and had hung 2 British soldiers in response to the hanging of 2 Stern Gang members. The blowing up of the British Army headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem was the last straw. Britain had laid the foundations of a future Zionist state and was no longer able to control the situation. This is why Britain was washing its hands of the mandate and handed over the responsibility to the United Nations. On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations Special Committee to Palestine had come up with a partition plan that was adopted by the General Assembly. Britain had declared its intention to withdraw from Palestine by the 15th of May 1948, which only let well-armed Zionist groups take power and conquer large portions of the country. When British troops had finally withdrawn from Palestine, the State of Israel was established. The establishment of the colonial state of Israel was known as Nakba by the Palestinians. It was a catastrophe that was accompanied by the removal of Palestinians from their homes and their villages, and it made them become refugees. Well-armed Zionists also destroyed over 400 villages in order to grab a major part of Palestine. The 2nd of November is a black day for Palestinians, and rightly so, because that day was the very same day in which a 130-word letter had laid the foundations for their removal from their homeland. To this day, around 12 million Palestinians are living under Israeli occupation or as refugees in both neighbouring countries and also all over the world, all of whom are longing to return to their homeland. The Palestinians made the most painful decision at Oslo in 1993, as they had agreed on a 2-state solution, and it would have given them a state of their own within the pre-1967 borders powers which made up of about 20% of historic Palestine. All of the imperialist states today, with the exception of Sweden and Greece, continue to pay lip service to the two-state solution. No Western government has fully recognized Palestine as an independent state because they still aid Israel financially and militarily, and they give diplomatic support to Israel, with Israel continuing with the incessant war against Palestine and the colonization of Palestine with full support from the Western imperialist countries. It is making the two-state solution seem more and more impossible. The Balfour Declaration pretty much laid the foundations for the dispossession of Palestinians, and it paved the way to a 100-year war, a war which can only be ended by the dismantling of this imperialist and criminal construct that is the Zionist state of Israel. It is then to be replaced by a free country, a country in which both Jews and Palestinians enjoy equal civil, political and religious rights. The Zionist establishment and its buddies are very unmindful as to what lies ahead. In 2017, the Zionist establishment was having a fucking field day celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. An advertisement by Simon Johnson, who was the chief executive of the Jewish Leadership Council, and he said in the Jewish Chronicle on the 2nd of November 2017, quote, "The government has resisted disgraceful calls for an apology and has clearly stated from the Prime Minister and other ministers and officials that the government will mark the Balfour Declaration with pride. The landmark dinner hosted by Lord Rothschild and Lord Balfour was attended by the Prime Minister and key ministers from both the UK and Israel. 100 years ago, Zionist statesmen and British ministers worked together to pave the way for a Jewish home in the land of Israel. In 2017, let us be proud that it was our government which took the first step to recognise the heritage of the Jewish people and which continues today to protect our connection with the land of Israel." Close quote. The Balfour Declaration is discussed all around communities in Britain. There are hundreds of events in synagogues across the country. There are lectures, programs and academic events in schools and universities too, as well as newspaper articles and journals. Therefore, we Marxist-Leninists are calling all who stand against Zionism, particularly anti-Zionist Jews, as well as all those who are friends of the Palestinian people and those who show solidarity to their struggle against Zionist Israel. We must expose the Balfour Declaration for what it really is: a shameful and evil document that has caused nothing but misery, war, and has damaged the integrity of the British people. It was the British government that was the architect of this tragedy. Those who are sympathetic to the Zionist state of Israel will ignore the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the pillage and the denial of all rights to the Palestinian people. And they'll try to tell you that Israel is this sort of beacon of democracy. So, comrades, here is a list of things that we must do to support the struggle of the Palestinians against Israeli Zionist imperialism. 1. We must recognize that Zionism is not a Jewish project. It is an imperialist one. 2. We must recognize that Zionism is against the interests of the Jewish masses. 3. We must recognize that Zionism is an ideology that rests on the false notion that European Jews do not belong to Europe and that all non-Jewish Europeans have the right, or in fact the duty, to get rid of their Jewish populations, is extremely racist and very anti-Semitic. 4. We must recognize that the Jewish state of Israel that was imposed onto Palestine can only be at the cost of the continued expulsion and the oppression of the rightful and lawful owners of that land, the Palestinian people, who have lived there for centuries. 5. We must recognize that the two-state solution is now impossible due to the continued Zionist settlement activity in Palestine. 6. We must recognize that Israel acts against international law and UN regulations with the full support of imperialist powers, especially the United States and Britain. 7. We must recognize that the Israeli Zionists and their supporters continue with their fascist-like behaviour through labelling every single anti-Zionist activity, organisation or individual as anti-Semitic. 8. We must recognise that the great Palestinian people have only one way to end their suffering: an armed resistance against the Israeli armed suppression, as material force can only be defeated by material force. 9. We must recognise that Zionism is a poisonous ideology that is a reactionary tool in the hands of imperialism. This reactionary tool is extremely harmful to the cause of Jewish emancipation as well as to that of the liberation of the Palestinian people. And finally, we must fully support the struggle of the Palestinian people by showing moral, political and even financial support without the fear of being branded as anti-Semitic by Zionists.